Hi, good afternoon, everyone, from Los Angeles, California. I'm Dr. Alexandra Katehakis, author of Sexual Reflections, a workbook for designing your own sexual health plan. And I want to welcome you to my Ask Me Anything Sexual Reflections webinar today. So I originally thought this would be a useful forum for people because I've gotten a lot of inquiries since I wrote or published the workbook, which is in May. A lot of feedback from colleagues and from clients alike who wanted to ask some questions. So I really wanted to open the door for both professionals and readers to be able to ask me any questions you have about the workbook, how it might be used, places where you might be struggling or concerns you might have about it. I was originally not thinking about writing another book, but when I was working on my dissertation for my doctorate in clinical sexology, I had to create a sexual health model for those in recovery from sexual addiction. Actually, I didn't have to. That was my choice of topics. And the most creative part of that process for me was this model that emerged. I probably wrote it in 2 or 3 days because it was one of the most creative things I've ever done. And I was super excited about it and seeing that, wow, a workbook just came out of this research project that I wanted to share with the community. After that, I had my colleague, Terry Marks Tarlow, who's a psychologist and amazing author and artist, illustrate the book. And that gives people an opportunity to color images that really evoke what's happening deeper in their psyche. It helps them get clarity about what's true for them sexually and what isn't. So that's how the workbook was born, if you will. So in this forum, I wanted to, if you want to verbally ask a question, all you have to do is click that little icon on the bottom of the screen that looks like a hand, because that tells us that you're raising your hand. And when we see the hand raised, my team will enable your microphone so that you can verbally ask me a question. If you want to submit a question in a written form, at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice a Q&A icon. So you can click on that, and that will allow you to type in your question. But before you send it, when you hit submit, you can submit the question anonymously if you like. If you don't submit it anonymously, then everybody will see your name. So be mindful of that. You just want to check the box that says anonymous before you hit submit. So we already have a few questions that people have sent in ahead of time. So I thought I'd start with those, and then you can ask questions as we go along. Feel free to type them in or raise your hand anytime during this conversation, and I will be happy to answer your question. So the first question came from a psychologist who is also looks like she's becoming a certified sex addiction therapist. Actually, she's a marriage family therapist. And she writes, what are your suggestions for a client who has low to no libido? So that means that person is not feeling a sex drive because they're on a certain kind of medication, which is not uncommon for people that are on medication. Oftentimes, the medication that helps people abate depression or anxiety also lowers their sex drive. And also, with the couple, both of them are extreme introverts. So what are my suggestions to help them re-engage sexually while they're in recovery from sex addiction? So that is precisely one of the purposes of sexual reflections. So my recommendation would be that you would start with the person who identifies as the sex addict and take him or her through the workbook. Because the workbook asks people to get very, very explicit about what their values are. What are their personal values, and then looking at what their sexual values are, and ultimately you're going to see if those two things align. And that is actually an exercise you could have the couple do also, so that one partner can do theirs in private and the other does the same, and then you bring them together to see how do their values align, or do they align? Because if their values don't align at all, then it's probably not a good match for the relationship to begin with. But if their values cross over, because typically they do, then what are their sexual values? In other words, what is arousing to you sexually? What do you like sexually? What do you want in your sex life? What components have you told your partners about, and what components have you not told your partner about? And this is the time to start getting honest about what's really true for you as you learn what it is for yourself as well. So that's where I would start with the couple. And this matter of libido is very interesting because I think we have strong sex drives at different times in our lives, certainly as teenagers, where we want to have sex with just about anything or everything, depending on how the person's physiology is set up. Certainly that's not true for those who identify as demisexual, and I'm going to talk about demisexuality on Monday, August 8th at noon in my webinar for Mirror of Intimacy. But for those people that have sort of in the middle of the bell curve sex drives, typically they're strong in our 20s, 30s, and then they can start to wane in our 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so at what point does sex become about something else? Drive? So I would ask this couple what the purpose of sex is. Why do they want to be having sex at this juncture? And what do they like sexually? What's arousing to them sexually? What aligns with their values sexually? And all of this is in Sexual Reflections, the workbook, as I said, because it forces people to do a lot of writing about that. And it allows the therapist to work with people in session to start to track what they're noticing in their body. What's really true for them versus what's really shameful for them. Is the shame about sexual shame or things they were told were dirty, bad, and wrong? Or is it shame that's born out of early trauma that they keep repeating over and over again? So really teasing out what is shameful but that you would like to do and not feel shame about versus what is shameful because it feels icky and it links to the violation in your childhood that you actually don't want to be doing anymore. So there's a lot of complexity to this workbook, which is why it's best to do it with a therapist. But I think with this couple, if they start to answer some of these questions and look closely at what's true for them, then they will begin to re-engage sexually because they're having these dialogues with each other. And of course, the therapist has to be willing to be in explicit conversations about sex and sexuality as well. So does anybody have any questions about that? Because I don't see any anything in the chat at this moment. Oh, there we go. I just clicked the chat icon, so now I can see the box. Let's see. Jay writes, I'm curious of your feedback regarding my theory on people with self-loathing issues. They are notoriously selfish. I notice a shame complex combined with ego not only prevents them from putting others first, but also blocks their willingness to be honest with themselves and acknowledge that which they need to heal from in order to let go of their self-directed anger. Lip service is all you get from them. It's like they use that to reinforce their loathing. Well, I think that's a really accurate statement. I think shame is the mechanism that drives defensiveness. That will have somebody attacking another person or blaming another person because the person feels so much shame internally that the initial reaction is to defend against. And I think shame is tied tightly to self-loathing. And that does create a selfishness. There is a narcissism in that. It's wrapped around poor me, or I'm so horrible. As opposed to so the grandiose kind of narcissism that we're used to thinking about or seeing in the media all the time. But this does block a person's willingness to be honest. Shame is a barrier affect. It stops us from feeling joy, humility, vulnerability, love, closeness, or any other feeling state that we might have. And then people that are in relationship with that often feel held hostage to the shame and to the blame, and they will become victimized by that perpetration. And there is a victim-perpetrator dialectic there, if you will, or a chicken and egg experience where you don't know which came first. So I don't know if there's a question in that, but the lip service, you've got to get underneath the lip service. You've got to get underneath those cognitive defenses by challenging the person in a process about what they're doing and why they're doing it and what's really going on with them. And of course, those people have a tremendous difficulty with having empathy for other people also. So getting them, sometimes you have to teach cognitive empathy because affectively they can't access the empathy. Now, of course, if somebody is antisocial, that's a different matter. But this manner of self-loathing that's born of profound shame is something that therapists have to work with to help people get out from underneath that. So there's another question here also. It says, Alex, please share if you've ever had experience wherein Polygraph was failed through the sex addict, though the sex addict told the truth. My husband usually gets defensive when lies, but this time he started to cry. He was the one to insist on the polygraph. So polygraphs are not fail-proof. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't believe in them at all because there are false positives and false negatives. Oftentimes, if people, are lying, they'll fail a polygraph. If they're telling the truth, they usually pass it. But in this case, you're saying your husband failed and he didn't get defensive. He actually started to cry, and he was the one who insisted on the polygraph. I would recommend that you have a second polygrapher polygraph him with the exact same questions to see if that was indeed a false positive, or if his tears are a defense against his terror that he is lying and he's been caught lying. And I certainly don't want to ensnare him or anybody else with this, so you have to be very careful with this topic. But I would recommend that you find a highly reputable, highly skilled, certified polygrapher to get a second opinion about this. And that may help clear up where the gray area is. So another question that somebody sent in was rather not a question about the workbook necessarily. It was about a question about mismatched desire, about quality and quantity. And so I would say again that for both parties to really start to explore their sexuality, oftentimes that requires a skilled sex therapist, so that you're not just trying to go this alone. And mismatched desire is often an issue in couples. And this also takes me back to the question about the person who is on medication and for a mood disorder and their libido is being compromised because of it. This notion that sex is intercourse is really a limited notion. There are so many ways to experience sexual pleasure, sexual expression, sexual variation. And unless people get scrupulously honest with themselves about what that is, they're always going to be in this limited band. So for example, I would pose a question to you of what is your secret sexual fantasy? If I were to ask you to write that down right now, and nobody was going to know the answer to it but you, and you were to write it down, or if you're alone, you said it out loud right now, do you have the courage to tell your lover, your partner, about that secret sexual fantasy? Because your partner or the person who has the lower libido may say, well, I don't have sexual fantasies because I don't take time to read erotica or think about myself as a sexual being, or I feel overweight, or I'm sluggish, or I'm tired all the time. And so if I don't know what's arousing to me personally, then I'm going to have a low sex drive with my partner, and my partner is there trying to figure this out. This is what we see. The high desire partner is buying books and buying sex toys, and it's trying to pump up a bicycle tire that's got a hole in it. The air's always leaking out of it because the person with the low desire is not doing their own work. So both parties really have to examine this question of what turns me on today, not 5 years ago, not 20 years ago, but who am I today in this body with this physiology? And what if I don't even think of myself as a sexual being anymore? What am I going to do about that if I have a partner who does and who wants to have sex? Now you've got this big chasm. So how are you going to bridge that chasm? You can't expect your partner to just live without it or go without it, because that's not really love. That's compromise and negotiation. If you are with a person and you want to stay with them, but you don't want to have sex with them, then you're going to have difficult conversations about, a non-monogamous, or what Tammy Nelson calls a consensual non-monogamous relationship, where again, you're talking about the rules and regulations about sex and sexuality. So there's a whole lot here to investigate. These are not just one, shot answers. So I see another question here in the Q&A box. So I'm going to answer that from Greg. He says, I've never felt that I've made the connection between sex and love. To me, sex is exciting because it's naughty. I didn't have a lot of religious training, but this seems to be an element of my shame when not being able to perform with someone I'm cultivating feelings for. Do you have advice on this matter? So yes, I would say, Greg, that this is all about intimacy, and what we sometimes call a fear of intimacy. So this is where you've split off sex and sexuality, where sex is arousing to you because it's naughty, but you can't show that to a partner. And so this is precisely what I've been talking about, where your work would be in therapy, is what scares you about letting someone that you love deeply see you in those sexual positions, saying the things that you like to say, doing the things you like to do. In that resides judgment, fear of being rejected, fear of being abandoned, and really fear of being seen. And loving deeply is being able to have, wild, animalistic, erotic sex with someone you love, and really being seen. So you have to risk being vulnerable, because right now you're hiding your vulnerability by having either anonymous partners or casual partners, and not really being able to get close to somebody and show them your sexual self. So there's another question here about wanting to rebuild intimacy in sexual relationship. So again, this looks like a question that people are asking about. So you're saying that our sexual relationship has been centered on his pleasure and me feeling like I couldn't provide enough to satisfy him in bed. And that the dysfunction in the sex life has impacted both by his addiction as well as my codependency and lack of confidence. I would say about your sexual self, I would give you a blank stare if asked about your sexual self. As I've not ever explored that aspect of myself. Doing so now brings up memories, negative mental loops of my husband's acting out, primarily porn, excessive flirting, and cyber sex, and makes this process challenging. Would this book be beneficial for both of us? I'm concerned that the exercises will be triggering it. I'm also trying to explore every avenue to recover from this horrific pain. So that was a paraphrase that the attendee asked, but I want to, address that question, because sexual reflections, as I said, was born out of a research study specifically for sex addicts, and that was by design. It's very difficult to do a research project that's sort of broad and scattershot. So partners were not eliminated from this workbook on purpose. It was just a way to make it most effective for addicts. So it was written for the sex addict. So I would suggest that your husband should work with this workbook in session with a therapist, so he can look at all the things that he's been doing, why he's been doing them, and what his true sexual preference is. I would suggest that you take portions of this, because some of it's not going to be relevant to you. You don't have a sexual addiction cycle. You weren't acting out sexually, but you could adapt it to look at, what did you like sexually before sex addiction? And unfortunately, your sexuality was grossly violated by your husband lying to you and cheating on you and using you as a sexual object Um, and that has to be unbelievably painful and really destructive to your own sexuality. So I want to recommend that you slow way down, that you're not obligated to be sexual with him in any way, shape, or form right now until you start to pick up these shattered pieces of yourself and you start to ask yourself, you know, what you like sexually and what you want. And you may find that you may not ever be able to be sexual with him again. And maybe you're avoiding answering some more challenging questions for yourself about whether you can even stay in this relationship, which is not necessarily a popular line of thinking in the world of sex addiction treatment. So you have to get very clear about yourself, what pieces you've lost, what's true for you, what you want going forward, and whether this is the person you want to do it with before you can answer the question of what do I want sexually. And that's why the blank stare, because your own self is still not put back together again. So don't feel obligated or don't move too quickly on this. Sexual Reflections was written for addicts in recovery long after they've been in recovery a good solid year, have been through full formal disclosure, who are with partners who have done the work also, and they're both in agreement they want to go forward. Or for the single person, maybe like Greg, who's writing for the first time about, I don't know how to be sexually present with one person at a time. So for the single person in recovery, not that Greg is saying he's a sex addict by any means, but for the single person in recovery too. So someone writes, what's the difference between a sex addict and a love addict? Well, there is a difference, and there's a difference with porn addicts also. So the sex addict is someone who's using sex compulsively in a way that they state is destructive for them. So it's not about the sexual behaviors being problematic. So I'm not judging any sexual behaviors whatsoever between consenting adults. It's the use of sex in a way that starts to become destructive in a person's life, where they start to create pain and suffering and destruction and what's generally called unmanageability in 12-step circles. So alcoholics experience this with alcohol, drug users do it with drugs, sex addicts do it with sex. And typically it aligns for them, if you look back historically into their family of origins, that they either grew up in a family where there was sex addiction, or their sexuality was shamed, or their sexuality was shut down for some reason. And that is the genesis of it. Or they were sexually tampered with as children. So they're repeating something and they're using a process, in this case a bodily based function, in a maladaptive way to manage their anxiety, their depression, their internal dysregulation. And similarly, love addicts do the same, only they live in a world of fantasy. There's a high level of preoccupation for them. They don't actually get in relationship with people, or when they do it in such a way where they're not in reality. So the limerence stage that we all experience when we're falling in love with somebody, where we're thinking about what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're going, if they're going to call us, why haven't they texted? Are we going to go out this weekend? What should I wear? You know, should I drive by his house? Shouldn't I drive by his house? All of that is the limerence phase, which is accelerated by high subcortical dopamine because of the degree of novelty that's all in service of getting us to attach to another human being. These are biological directives that Helen Fisher and many others have written about. The love addict will stay in relationship with people, though, that aren't giving them cues that they want to be in relationship with them. So the person doesn't call them back, or they don't show up, or they go out on a date and they don't hear from them again. But they keep pushing the fantasy and staying in fantasy about what they want that person to be, rather than being in reality with what the facts are that person is showing up. So they inevitably chase people that are not available, and they're constantly enamored with the person who's not available, because they themselves are no more available than the fantasy person. So they're not looking for sex per se, as much as they're looking to be in a relationship, but they're looking for it with unavailable persons. All right, so Another questions, someone says physical attributes are important. So what do I do if a man has a small penis? How as a woman do I go about obtaining more pleasure through intercourse? It's just not there. What should I do? Well, that's something you're going to have to decide. You know, who is this person to you? Is this somebody that you share a similar value system with, that you enjoy their company, there's good companionship, they make you laugh, they're fun, they're intelligent, like they meet all your criteria for a good relationship, but you don't get enough friction when it comes to intercourse? And if that's the case, there are 1,000,001 sex toys out there today. The Pleasure Chest here in Los Angeles is one of the biggest, most comprehensive sex toy shops in the country, possibly the world. So I would suggest that you start to look for sex toys that will bring you that kind of stimulation and pleasure. And if you and your partner are willing to venture into those areas and try different things, and you're satisfied with that, then you can have a healthy sex life with this person. If that's not what you want, if a penis size is of, you know, in your top 3 most important things, then I suggest that you break up with that person and that you move on. Those are your options. But to suffer in silence or to blame your partner is a form of lying, actually. It's a form of lying by omission. I would also say that this depends on each person, but there are surgeons who will do penile enhancement surgeries. You need to find someone who does a lot of them, who's really good at them, where they can increase the length and girth of the penis through prosthetics, which are similar. Actually, they're implants. They're very similar to implants that are used in breast implantation today. They're thin silicone implants, but again, you have to contact a competent surgeon and go through that process. It's not something I'm recommending. I don't know you, but I'm saying that is an option. So you do have options with that. Another question here is, have you used sexual reflections with female sex workers? I'm curious about your experience with this population in early recovery when they've decided to continue their work in recovery and are trying to develop a sexual health plan within that. So I would say, Anna, I personally have not used it with sex workers who are getting out of the business, but I would if they had been in recovery for at least a year. And really, I think for that person, it's going to take a longer time for them to decide what feels good to them sexually, what is not compromising their integrity or violating them in any way. And this is so unique and different to everybody. And I think that's why the workbook is so powerful, because therapists are going to be tracking somatic cues with that person. So even though the person might say, yeah, that's fine, I think I want to do that, you're going to be tracking what they're noticing in their body, how they're feeling, what you're feeling, what you know about their history, and maybe challenging them to either consider that that is a healthy behavior, or there's something in the book that we call a watch and wait list, that you're going to watch and wait to see if that's a behavior or sex act they want to sort of reintegrate into their sexuality, or wait. And when they do reintegrate it, to come back and talk about, what was that like? Did you dissociate? Did you start to feel icky? Or was it pleasurable? Could you stay with your partner? Also, having a trusting partner is going to be crucial to the people that are recovering from sex addiction, or sex workers, or anybody who's had any sexual abuse. These are not matters that we should lunge at. And one of the mistakes that people make in sex, I think, in general, especially those that struggle with premature ejaculation or sexual dysfunction issues, is that we all just move too fast. The skin is the biggest sex organ in the body. After, the brain is the most important one, but the skin is our biggest organ. So touch and contact and sensation play and all of that should exist long before penetration of any sort, whether it's anal or vaginal penetration comes down the pike, so to speak. So taking time is important. Dear Alex, is there any difference between love addict and codependent? And what is the difference between sex addict and porn addict? I thought porn addict might go further and become sex addict anytime. Okay, so Pia Mellody, who wrote a book called Facing Codependence, clearly states that an addict of any stripe cannot heal their addiction without first healing their codependence. So what we know now is that codependence is a traumatic reaction to growing up in a family that was patently unsafe. And so what that means is if you've got violence or neglect or alcoholism in the original family of origin, the child is going to create adaptive strategies to make sure that they're okay. And so if that means they have to people please, if that means they have to be the straight A student, if that means they have to look good at all costs so as not to ignite the ire of the perpetrator in the family, that's what they do. And then, of course, these are adaptive strategies, and we learn to do this over time in our families and later in our relationships. Then if you have an addiction on top of that, you've got to heal that addiction. But you've got to look at the underpinnings of the codependency, the people pleasing, the tendency to not have boundaries would be another way of putting it. And this is not about eradicating interdependency, which is crucial for the survival of the human species, but looking at the ways in which we violate our boundaries in order to accommodate other people. The love addict is different than the codependent in that they're living in this world of preoccupation and fantasy, which is really moderately to severely dissociative. And they are likely going to have codependent behaviors because they're going to accommodate the other person all the time because they're not looking at what they want and need, because they've got to keep this fantasy about who they are alive. Now, all of these things bleed together. There's no hard line on any of this. These are cognitive structures where we're trying to illustrate an idea that we can put into these discrete boxes, but nothing in life works in discrete boxes. So you have to be flexible in how you think about them. And then the porn addict that we see here are people that are strictly looking at pornography. The porn addict is not interested in touching another person. They're not going to cheat on their relationships. They're going to be using porn as a way to check out. Oftentimes, people have avoidant personality structures or attachment structures. And so they're not looking for validation from other people. They're just looking at pornography. They're masturbating compulsively. And they are avoiding being in real relationships for real people. They can be very, very isolated as well. So for some people, porn addiction can lead to acting out sexually. But people that are truly porn addicts are not necessarily having contact with other people. Someone asks, what is the role of PTSD in affair recovery? Well, I think the role for the therapist is that you have to really be scrupulous about your assessment of the person who's been betrayed, whether it's a single incident trauma or there's been or single incident affair, or there have been multiple string of not only affairs, but sex workers, chat rooms, internet activity, you name it, that you have to screen for acute stress disorder, because I would say all partners, all people who are betrayed are in an acute stress state. Not all of them have post-traumatic stress disorder, but some do. And those who do typically have gaping childhood wounds that were never healed to begin with. So if somebody was abandoned early on, let's say a female by her father, and her mother was enraged about that, and her mother never got over that, and she never saw her father, and she was always looking for her father, or he would say he would show up and he wouldn't, she's likely going to pick somebody who's going to abandon her because that's what she knows. So she gets involved with somebody because she's no more available than the person she chooses is. And maybe she doesn't know that he's going to cheat on her. But she gets involved with him and he does cheat on her. And now she's in her original trauma as well as the present day trauma. So this particular population is the most challenging to work with, and it requires a skilled psychotherapist to do so, because this is a population of people who have been heartily victimized. And before they can look at any of what their part has been in it, they've got to heal the original and acute trauma. So my answer to that question is assessment. You have to do a high level of assessment to see what this person needs going forward. And, are they going to need medication? Do they need supportive therapy? Do they need a group? Do they need a 12-step program? What's going to help them the most become regulated before you can really start to do any kind of deeper therapy with them? It's like being a first responder. If someone's in a car accident, you're not going to start querying them about whether they made a left or right turn. You're going to deal with the acute trauma that's in front of you. So let's see. A next question here is, can you talk about how some people need others to make them feel worthy compared to those who provide it for themselves? Well, I'm talking about the difference perhaps between secure attachment and insecure attachment, although there's a nuance to that also. What does that stem from? Unmet needs. What are specific characteristics of those who don't look outside of themselves for feeling worthy? So when people don't look to others to feel worthy, we could say that they're securely attached, that they grew up in a household where their parents attended them, where they took good care of them, where they saw them, they validated them, and they were appropriately stewarded as they grew up, and they launched and they went away and left their family of origin, but they still have relationships with their parents. And internally, they feel good about themselves. They seek validation when it's appropriate, or when somebody says you did a good job or you deserve this promotion, they feel good inside, like they know that they did a good job. They don't shrink into shame or dismiss it or push it away. Now, if somebody is too good at not needing other people, they may be more avoidant and not secure. They would be more insecurely attached. So that's why there are complexities to all of these questions, and this is why you should ask your therapist about your own self. This is sort of a general question and answer section here. So those who need others to make them feel worthy all the time are struggling with what we call a narcissistic injury. They didn't have somebody who was telling them growing up, I see you, you're doing a good job, I'm proud of you. And was really not just sort of fluffing them up that way, but truly interested in what was happening by asking them about the essay they wrote or the picture they colored that was involved in their school, that was asking teachers what their child wanted and needed, etc. Like parents that are really parenting. So yes, these are met by unmet psychological needs. So I think I answered that question sort of in general. And then I think we have time almost for a final question here or two. I'm going to answer this question first. Can't the partner experience PTSD from the infidelity, not necessarily family of origin issues, or would not call this PTSD? That's a very nuanced question again. My bias is that if a person is completely securely attached, and they find out about an affair or they find out about sex addiction, they're going to be highly dysregulated. They are going to have some PTSD features in that they're going to have intrusive images in their head. They're going to be sick to their stomach. Maybe they can't sleep. These are all features of post-traumatic stress, but do they have the full-blown disorder? Not likely. And honestly, the people that are the most securely attached end up leaving marriages when there's betrayal. They just say, that's it, I'm done. It's like a domestic violence situation. Somebody hits me, that's my boundary, and I leave. I don't stay for that. So generally, those people have more internal resilience than somebody who is really tipping over into full disorder. They likely have a lot of family of origin untreated trauma themselves. Now, let me just say that, if we were all in an airport together and a bomb went off, it doesn't matter how securely attached you are, you're likely going to have post-traumatic stress disorder, because it's the point the nervous system cannot take the data that's blasting into it, and that system is going to get highly dysregulated. So again, I want to be careful because this is a case-by-case situation. These broad strokes are generalizations, and they're just not true for everybody, which is why you need a good therapist, and therapists need to do good assessments. So one other question here. Someone says, I'm interested in both attending the 11-day intensive in the future and possible integrate the work into my skill set and my practice. I'd like to know who the current therapists for the intensive and what background relative to experience, training, education. I've heard Alex present in a one-day seminar last year and was much impressed. If the staff are capable, I'd be thrilled, etc. Okay, so my answer to this question is that I supervise all of my staff here. Our intensive program here for both men and women who identify as sex and love addicts is an 11-day program. We only take 4 people for the express purpose of being able to give very close in attention to each person that's here. So it's not a group of 15 or 20. People cannot hide out here, nor do they usually want to if they come here. So I personally train all of my therapists here, and I am personally involved in each one of the people's intensive process as they're here. So that is my best answer to my questions. If my therapists weren't or if people weren't competent or they didn't have enough of a skill set, we wouldn't hire them to work here. So I do have a high standard. I stand by the work that we do here, and I'm involved in all of the cases here. Even if you're here for group therapy or for outpatient treatment, I know what's going on with all of the cases here. All right, so I think we have time for one last question because this is meant to end in an hour. Let me just see if I have something a little bit different here. Somebody asks, I have low self-esteem and maybe a love addict. Can I be cured? Well, the word cured is a funny word. I don't think we use it in the world of psychotherapy because that implies an endpoint to something. And I think as human beings, we are constantly evolving and changing and hopefully being generative into the later stages of our lives. But yes, the low self-esteem and love addiction are tied together because it's like the self-loathing question. If you have low self-esteem, you're going to chase people that don't want you. And what you really want is to move towards somebody, which is a very vulnerable thing to say, I'm attracted to you, or I want to go out with you. And you want somebody who's going to meet you, who's going to want you back. And if you have low self-esteem, you'll settle for people that don't want you back. So I would encourage you to read the book Facing Love Addiction, to go to a sex and love addiction meeting, go to 6 meetings and just listen for the similarities, and start to read some of the love addiction and codependency literature to see if it resonates for you. And if it does, then go get the help you need so that you can choose wisely and choose somebody that wants you because you deserve to have that. So finally, someone says, 2 questions, and then I'm going to stop. One is asking about my training coming up in Arlington, Virginia. That training is a sex therapy training. It's a 15-hour course that is strictly about sex therapy. And so it's a large information download. It's not a how-to-do therapy workshop, which we advertise that clearly, but we talk about anatomy, physiology, sexual trauma, sexual desire, dysfunction issues, alternative sexual practices, sex toys, a whole host of information on sex and sexuality. So if you want to kind of bone up on general sex therapy, it's a great intro workshop for that. The hours count towards ASEX certification if you happen to be an ASEX certified sex therapist, or if you're becoming one as well. And what would you, let's see, what would be the downside to doing the workbook by myself as opposed to with the therapist? Well, this book is designed to do it with the therapist so that they can take you through a process. When we do things by ourselves, we can trick ourselves into telling ourselves that something is okay or not. But when you've got a therapist that knows you, they know what your history has been, they know what your recovery looks like, they're going to be able to challenge or ask you self-reflexive questions that has you getting closer to the bone of what is really true for you and what's healthy and what's right. And they're going to help you tease out things that maybe the quote addict part of yourself wants to get away with. So I would encourage you to do it with a therapist so that you get the full experience of the workbook doing that. And I also want to remind all of you that we have lots of resources on centerforhealthysex.com that our intake counselors are available to you now at 310-843-9902, where they're happy to answer any questions you have about our programs here. And also, give you resources for people in your area in case you want to get help with any of these issues of sex, sexuality, or sex and love addiction. So thank you for your attention and for the robust dialogue that we had here today. I want to remind you that Sexual Reflections, the workbook, can be found on Amazon.com. And if you're using the workbook or you have found it useful, please leave a review so other people can read it as well. I always appreciate your support, whether it's for Mirror of Intimacy or this book or any other book. So for now, be healthy, be sexy, ask yourself questions about your sex life so that you can live a life of sexual pleasure, not a life where you're hiding your sexuality or worse yet, using it in ways that are destructive to you. All right, thank you and have a good day.